a few examples which will serve as my model for what I'm going to say later on. Example number 1. The issue of the Mahdi in Islam is a controversial one. And opinion is divided along sectarian lines, that is Sunnite Shiite lines. On it, there are several views on the need and possibility of the advent of a man who would come at the end of time and set things right in the world, fixing all that is rotten in it. This is what Iqbal says about the Mahdi. Whoever lets his khudi, selfhood emerge, he is the Mahdi, the one to come at the end of time. हुई जिसकी खुदी पहले नमूदार और वही महदी वही आखिर ज़माने. Also, he says, the world needs that true bona fide Mahdi whose looks would cause an earthquake in the world of thought. दुनिया को है उस महदी बरहक की ज़रूरत तो जिसकी निगाह ज़लज़लाए आलम अफ़कार. Example number 2. Iqbal was asked about the notion of imamah, another hotly contested issue between the Sunnites and the Shiites. And Iqbal responded as follows. I'll read the Urdu text first. तूने पूछी है इमामत की हकीकत मुझसे, हक तुझे मेरी तरह साहिब असरार करे, है वही तेरे ज़माने का इमाम बरहक जो तुझे हाजिर मौजूद से बेजार करे. And at the end, fitna millat बैज़ा है इमामत उसकी जो मुसलमान को सलातीन का प्रस्ताव करे. You want me to tell you the truth about the imamate? May God make you like me, one who is privy to secrets. He and he alone is the true imam of your age, who makes you indifferent to the here and now, literally to the present of the existent. The imamship of one who turns you into a worshipper of kings is a severe ordeal for the Muslim community. Example number 3. The Muslim Sufi Hallaj was executed in 922 for saying that he was God. An al-Haq, I am the truth, truth with the capital T, one of the names of God. Ever since then, Muslim opinion on Hallaj has been divided. Many great scholars defending him, but many great scholars, on the other hand, condemning him. Iqbal deals with the issue in a totally different way. And he says, I am the truth, an al-Haq. This phrase, that is. This phrase is protestation befitting a divine majesty. Is it to be punished with crucifixion or not? If an individual says that, he should be reprimanded, but it is not inappropriate if said by a nation. An al-Haq juz maqame kibriya neez sazae u chalifa hast janeez agar farde biguyat sarzanish beh agar qawme biguyat narawa neez. Now, these 3 examples have one thing in common. In each, Iqbal introduces an issue, but instead of picking one of the traditionally held positions on it, as I said, rephrases the issue in radically new terms. Who is the Mahdi? One who manifests his khudi before all others. Who deserves to be called Imam? One who turns his followers' attention away from petty things and leads them in pursuit of higher goals. And what about Hallaj's claim of an al-Haq? I am the truth. Totally inappropriate for an individual to make that claim, but quite appropriate if made by a nation. One almost feels that Iqbal, instead of confronting these issues head-on, trivializes them. So, is this why we call him a great thinker? This is precisely the point where I want you to pause for a moment and consider the matter a little more carefully. The greatness of Iqbal consists not in that he provides fresh or more compelling reasons in support of this or that conventionally received view on this or that issue, but in that he changes the whole discourse about the issues themselves. And how does he change that discourse? He does so by examining, critiquing, and judging all ideas at the bar of his own thought, and approving, rejecting, or ignoring ideas depending on whether they are in accord with, or in conflict with, or are ungermane to his thought. In his works, Iqbal reproduces, refers to, and comments on the ideas of a large number of writers, thinkers, politicians, mystics, and others. But as a rule, he does not dwell on those ideas for their own sake. This is important. He does not dwell on those ideas for their own sake, but for their value in illustrating, clarifying, reinforcing, or refining his own thought. This is the crux of it. This is the main point I want to make today. After years and years of serious study and deep reflection, Iqbal had evolved his own system of thought, which he now undertakes to present in his prose and poetical works. And it is in the course and context of presenting that system of thought that he deals with the ideas of others positively or negatively. The linchpin of Iqbal's thought is perhaps the concept of khudi. Dr. Majid pointed to that. Selfhood. Now this is a complex and multifaceted concept. As Nikolai Petrovich Anikia says, this concept stands out in all of Iqbal's works and is his determining, in fact, his starting point in his solution to all the other cosmological problems. Unquote. Every living being has its khudi, its I or ego or selfhood. At the highest level is the absolute ego, whose personal name is Allah or God. This divine khudi reveals itself by creating the phenomenal world to which human beings belong. At the human level, there is the khudi of the individual who must realize his or her unique potential through activity that is both purposeful and ceaseless. And there is the khudi of the group to which the individual belongs and whose ideals and values the actions of the individual members of the group are, in the end, meant to realize. There is an integral relationship between personal khudi and communal khudi. Khudi is dynamic and always in a state of becoming. It is averse to passivity and inertia. It creates ever new goals and then sets about the task of achieving them. Khudi seeks to actualize itself in a state of freedom, but its true freedom consists in its subjecting itself to the will of God, the alignment of the will of the individual with the will of God, leading to liberation from all mundane constraint. The forces of life that nourish and strengthen khudi are positive and life-enhancing, whereas the forces that starve and enervate khudi are negative and life-denying. For example, art and literature that build up khudi are wholesome, whereas art and literature that undermine khudi are harmful. There are several other aspects of khudi that one needs to be mindful of, but I'll content myself with the foregoing description. So far, I've made two main points. One, that Iqbal uses his own thought to process, filter, and evaluate, and even adapt and reinterpret all other thought. Two, that the key to his own thought is the concept of khudi. These 2 points, taken together, furnish us with the criterion which we can use to answer the question, was Iqbal a Sufi? I think, and I'm not the first one who thinks so, that Sufism, as traditionally understood and practiced in the Muslim world, is in direct conflict with Iqbal's concept of khudi. And that Iqbal consequently would be hesitant to be called a Sufi in the traditional sense. But then we first have to explain what Sufism is in the traditional sense. Sufism essentially is the name of a certain way of looking at and interpreting Islam. The fundamental doctrine of Islam, namely the oneness of God, Tawheed, is interpreted in a very special way in Sufism. The particular angle from Sufism approaches the doctrine from which Sufism approaches the doctrine is that of man's reunion with God. It would be hazardous to state that all Sufis hold to a single understanding of Tawheed, or of any other doctrine for that matter. Broadly though, one might say that Sufis stress the notion of union with God, irrespective of whether that union is taken in a metaphorical and a more real, ontologically significant Hallajian sense, in which is stressed not only the divinity of man, but also the humanity of God, the distinction between the divine and the human being ultimately erased. Sufis speak of man's annihilation, fana, in God, and of man's subsequent survival or subsistence, baqa, in God, the fana and baqa together involving a shedding of the individual human self and a merger in some sense with the divine essence. The whole idea being illustrated by means of a variety of similes and metaphors. Most Sufis would, of course, deny that the divine-human union represents a complete cancelling out of the human self and involves a thoroughgoing assumption by man of the divine self. Mainstream Sufism does not take a favorable view of the notion of hulul, incarnation or infusion of the divine essence in man, or ittihad, which is identification of the divine and human natures. Nevertheless, the basic thrust of the concept would seem to consist in a certain diminution of man qua man vis-a-vis God. To this view of man is squarely, starkly opposed Iqbal's view of man. The language of fana and baqa as employed in Sufism is alien to Iqbal. Instead of negating in any sense the human self, Iqbal affirms it in the most emphatic terms in his reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. In the first lecture, entitled Knowledge and Religious Experience, Iqbal discusses the nature of man. Quoting Quran 95, 15, and other verses, he says the following. Please bear with me as I quote him at some length. Endowed with the most suitable mutual adjustment of faculties, he discovers himself down below in the scale of life, surrounded on all sides by the forces of obstruction, a restless being engrossed in his ideals to the point of forgetting everything else, capable of inflicting pain on himself in his ceaseless quest after fresh scopes for self-expression. With all his failings, he is superior to nature. His career, no doubt, had a beginning, but he is destined, perhaps, to become a permanent element in the constitution of being. It is the lot of man to share in the deeper aspirations of the universe around him and to shape his own destiny as well as that of the universe, now by adjusting himself to its forces, now by putting the whole of his energy to mold its forces to his own ends and purposes. And in this process of progressive change, God becomes a co-worker with him, provided man takes the initiative, unquote. In lecture 4, The Human Ego, His Freedom and Immortality, the reconstruction, Iqbal says, quote, whatever may be the final fate of man, Dr. Majid quoted this also, whatever may be the final fate of man, it does not mean the loss of individuality. The Quran does not contemplate complete liberation from finitude as the highest state of human bliss. The unceasing reward of man consists in his gradual growth in self-possession, in uniqueness and intensity of his activity as an ego, as an I. And the climax of this development is reached when the ego is able to retain full possession, even in the case of a direct contact with the all-embracing ego, unquote. In his poetry, likewise, Iqbal repeatedly emphasizes the man's uniqueness. So you can see the correspondences between his poetry on the one hand and poetical prose works on the other hand. So, same thing in poetry. He emphasizes a man's uniqueness. This uniqueness including man's distinction from God. A couplet of Qayyum Mashriq reads, God created the world, but Adam improved upon it. Adam perhaps is the associate of God. Jahan, all free, magar ba izidam bazas Adam. The same word co-worker used in the prose is used in the poetry also. It is this theme that Iqbal elaborates in one of his best-known poems, a dialogue between God and man, in which God levels a few accusations against man, who in turn not only defends himself against the accusation, but also insinuates a few charges against God. God speaks first. It says, I made the world with the same water and clay, but you, that is man, God accusing man, but you created Iran, Tartary and Ethiopia. From the earth I brought forth a pure iron, but you turned it into sword, arrow, and gun. You made an axe for the tree in the garden and a cage for the songbird. Jahara ze yak abogil afridam, tu iran tataro sang afridi, manas kakula de nab afridam, tu shamshiro tiro tafang afridi, tabar afridi nihare chamamra, tafasakti tare nakmasandra. To this man gives the following response, saying to God, you made the night, I made the lamp. You made the night, I made the lamp. You made the earthen bowl, I made the goblet. You made deserts, mountains and valleys. I made gardens, meadows and parks. I am one who makes mirror out of stone and turns poison into sweet, delicious drink. Tushaba fridi, chira freedom, sifada fridi, ayaga freedom, bayaga nukufaru baga fridi, theyaba nukulzaru baga freedom, mananam kya sang ari nasazam, mananam as zehr nashi nasazam. In more than one verse, God distinguishes between lordship, khudai, and servantship to God, bandagi. And as a human being, unhesitatingly opts for servantship, a possible snub, I think, a possible snub to mystics who aspire after divinity or self-divinization. He says in one place, to be God is to have charge of land and sea. Being God is nothing but a headache. But being a servant of God, God forbid, that's no headache, that's a heartache. खुदाई इत्तिमा में खुश उतर है, खुदा बंदा खुदाई दर्द सर है, लेकिन बंदा की अस्तगफिरुल्लाह, ये दर्द सर नहीं, दर्द जिगर है. These and similar other passages from Iqbal's prose and poetical works underscore the fact that Iqbal believes in the independent, permanent, and real status of the human self. And this self is not subject to dissolution in any sense whatsoever under divine impact. Even when man is closest to God, he retains his individuality. As Iqbal puts it in the 4th lecture, the human ego is freedom and immortality or his reconstruction. The finite ego must be distinct, though not isolated, from the infinite. Pantheistic Sufis will certainly not approve of this statement, but the words, no less than the spirit of the statement of this and other statements by Iqbal, will not be liked by the generality of Sufis either. The stress in Iqbal falls squarely on man's distinction from God. This is the thrust of it. Man's distinction from God and on a certain elevation of human status vis-a-vis God, at which Sufis would look rather askance. It is true that Iqbal urges not only the assertion of khudi, but also the effacement of khudi when he speaks of bekhudi, selflessness. After all, the companion volume of Asrar-e-Khudi, Secrets of the Self, is Rumuz-e-Bekhudi, which is Mysteries of Selflessness. This is true. But Iqbalian Bekhudi, selflessness, does not involve the loss of khudi, personal khudi, in the sense that personal khudi is absorbed in communal khudi, and in the process to such an extent that it ceases to exist in its own right. It is not absorption, but contribution that Iqbal has in mind. The ideal envisaged by him requires that the individual, instead of challenging, defying, or negating the community, contribute to the building up of a strong, vibrant, and cohesive community, and do so by employing his or her talents and services for the promotion of a cause higher than that of his or her narrow, limited self. Given Iqbal's line of thinking, it is arguable that in the final reckoning, Bekhudi actually strengthens and deepens individual khudi. It does not efface, of course, it does not limit it either. It probably even makes it stronger. After all, how can Iqbal advocate the loss of the individual khudi vis-a-vis the community when he insists that the individual khudi survives even in its encounter with God? And here I'd like to refer to something that Professor Javed Majid says in his book, Allama Iqbal, Islam, Studies in Postcolonialism, after stating that, quote, the interplay between khudi and bekhudi is central to Iqbal's vision of an Islamic community. He says that, quote again, it is khudi and not bekhudi that has political and aesthetic priority in Iqbal's work. For, he adds again, the real interest of bekhudi derives from its interplay with selfhood. But the converse does not hold. Khudi is of interest in its own right. Unless khudi were there in the first place, there'd be no work for bekhudi to do. I did not misquote you, did I? So this is one, God and man. Next, a belief in the hereafter is one of the basic articles of the Islamic faith. The Quran teaches that this world is a temporary abode for human beings, and that an everlasting world will come into existence after this world has come to an end. The relationship between the two worlds is succinctly and graphically stated in a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. He said, this world is the seedbed of the next, ad-dunya mazra'atul akhirah. In other words, we act in this world and we get our recompense in the next. The hereafter, thus, can never be absent in the thought of a Muslim, Sufi or not. And yet, while monasticism is expressly proscribed, forbidden in Islam, the clear tendency in Sufism is to accord a decided preference to the next life at the expense, perhaps, of earthly life. Doctrinally, Iqbal would not challenge the importance of the hereafter in Islam. But again, practically, Iqbal puts his emphasis on this world. We detect an undertone of humor in the well-known couplet in which Iqbal addresses God and says, why did you order me to leave paradise? There's much work to do in the world here down below. You'll have to wait for me now. बागे बेहिश्त से मुझे हुक्म सफर दिया था क्यों? तारे जहां दराज है अब मेरा इंतजार है. You have to. I'm not coming back to you, right? Even if you want, even if you have regrets after banishing from me from paradise, and now you want me to come back to you, I'm not about to come back. Lots of work to do on this earth. In many verses, Iqbal, representing humanity, takes pride in turning this wilderness of a world into an eminently habitable place through persistent hard work coupled with vision and imagination. And he says in one of his poems, I am guilty because I ate of the forbidden tree, Adam speaking through Iqbal. I am guilty and I am an alien in this world, but the angels failed to make that desolate world of yours a thriving place, that rude wilderness, that insubstantial world of yours is grateful to me for the pains I took, that is to transform it. कसूरवार गरीब दियार हूँ लेकिन तेरा खराबा फरिश्ते न कर सके आबा मेरी जफा तलबी को दुआएं देता है वो दश्त सादा वो तेरा जहान बेबुनियाद. In similar vein is the poem Dialogue Between God and Man, to which we have referred already. A very powerful poem in which Iqbal, again, in practical, not any standpoint, expresses his decided preference for this world over heavenly existence is Satguzashte Adam, the story of man, in which Adam recounts his exploits in the various parts of the world after having left the Garden of Eden, the opening lines of which run as follows. What a story I have to tell to anyone who would listen of how I traveled in foreign lands, that is various parts of the world to which man is foreign. That was man's home, Garden of Eden. This world is a foreign land for him. Of how I traveled in foreign lands, I forgot the story of the first covenant. Now, a Sufi would not like this at all. This is what Iqbal says. I forgot the story of the first covenant. I felt ill at ease in the garden of heaven when I drank the fiery cup of awareness. I have always searched about the truth of the world, showing the celestial heights of my heart. Just a couple of verses which begin the poem. सुने कोई मेरी गुर्बत की दास्तां मुझसे भुलाया किस्सा है पैमाने अव्वली मैंने लगी न मेरी तबीयत रियाज जन्नत में पिया शहूर का जब जामे आतशी मैंने रही हकीकत आलम की जुस्तजू मुझको दिखाया और ये ख्याल फलक निशी मैंने. All this is very un-Sufi-like, and how can one forget that immortal poem Tazkir-e-Fitrat, Conquest of Nature, to which Dr. Nabi referred. Also in Bayan Mashriq, another very un-Sufi-like piece in which Adam takes revenge on Satan. How? By subjugating the world of the elements. A word about another Sufi doctrine. Iqbal seemed to reject the Sufi distinction between exoteric knowledge, ilm zahir, and esoteric knowledge, ilm batin. In Sufi conception, as one would expect, the two are generically different, with momentous consequences for the interpretation of the whole range of Islamic religious thought. Iqbal would not approve of this distinction. One of the motifs in his reconstruction is the importance of empirical knowledge. In the opening lecture of the work, he defined knowledge as, quote, sense perception elaborated by understanding, unquote, and goes on to speak of the general empirical attitude of the Quran, which engendered in its followers a feeling of reverence for the actual and ultimately made them the founders of modern science, unquote. Iqbal does not deny the role of intuition in apprehending reality, but his understanding of intuition is not exactly what a typical Sufi would understand by it. For he says, quote, we must not regard it as a mysterious special faculty. These are his words. We must not regard intuition as a mysterious special faculty, unquote. It is true that Iqbal would not mind to use the word mystical for this faculty. He does use that, but there's a red flag over there. But after noting that there is nothing about the faculty of intuition, nothing mysterious, he says that, quote, it is rather a mode of dealing with reality in which sensation, in the physiological sense of the word, does not play a part, yet the vista thus open to us is as real and concrete as any other experience. To describe it as psychic, mystical, supernatural does not detect from its value as experience, unquote. But it's obvious that Iqbal is here using the word mystical in deference to the particular background of the audience of his reconstruction, Western educated audience, for whom use of a certain vocabulary, the word mystic or mystical, one of those words, make the subject matter more comprehensible. But very clearly says that, quote, the difference of the mystic state, this is key, the difference of the mystic state from the ordinary rational consciousness does not mean discontinuance with the normal consciousness. And the whole edifice of Sufi theology is built on this notion of discontinuance or discontinuity, and Iqbal denies that. I mentioned above Iqbal's admiration for many well-known Sufis in Islamic history. That does not make him a Sufi, though. Both in his prose and poetical works, Iqbal quotes and discusses a very large number of distinguished people from all walks of life, various religious, cultural, and political backgrounds, from various different geographical regions and from several epochs of history. But, as I said earlier, whenever Iqbal cites, for example, a thinker or a man of action, he focuses on that element of thought or conduct of that person which bears some relevance to his own thought. See, his own thought is always the arbiter. That is what we have to keep in mind. He focuses on that element of thought or conduct of that person which bears some relevance to his own thought or philosophy. Take Rumi, the most important example. Rumi disapproves of the notion of khudi, which he understands in the traditional sense of vanity or arrogance. On Iqbal's own statement, it was Rumi who appeared to him in a dream and urged Iqbal to give up the lament pent up, to give voice to the lament pent up in his heart. But Iqbal's reverence for Rumi does not keep him from radically reinterpreting the term khudi in the same book, Asar-e-Khudi, which was inspired by Rumi. Different interpretation altogether. From Rumi, Iqbal does not borrow. From Rumi, Iqbal does not borrow those ideas which bear on the particular Sufi doctrine of union of God and man, but the message of action. This is the particular, I think, the relationship between Rumi and Iqbal has been misunderstood almost totally. And people regard Rumi in the Sufi in the same mold as other Sufi. That's not the case. It's Rumi's message of action that Iqbal focuses on. The preface to Asar-e-Khudi is the famous ghazal of Rumi's in which the writer complains of lazy companions, hamrahan sust anasir. A major motif in all of Iqbal's work is constant evolution. In the reconstruction, Iqbal cites Rumi to support that idea. Iqbal's highly selective selective approach to Sufis and others in his work is a subject that remains to be studied. And the same is true of other Sufis. Iqbal discusses for example, Fakhruddin Iraqi. Iqbal does not take any of his ideas concerning Wahdatul Wujud, unity of existence of being. He does not. What does he cite from Iraqi? His view that there are multiple space orders and multiple time orders. Because that is relevant to Iqbal's own philosophy. And he ignores everything else. Ahmad Sarhindi, Iqbal does not take from him or discuss his concept of Wahdat al-Shuhud, unity of witness or vision, appearance, in contrast to Wahdat al-Wujud. What does he take from Ahmad Sarhindi? His opposition to the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir. Akbar producing Deen Ilahi, God's religion, divine. So this is how Iqbal approaches Sufism. Not only Sufism, all other subjects. So one major thing that needs to be studied in Iqbal then is first establishing Iqbal's own viewpoint and then looking at Iqbal's appropriation, his comment on, his criticism of the ideas that Iqbal picks from all these writers, Sufis or non-Sufis. I said in the beginning that Iqbal was certainly not a Sufi in the sense in which Sufism is sometimes understood and promoted in the West. That statement gives voice to my suspicion that for right or wrong reasons, the West today feels at ease with a non-threatening, depoliticized Islam. And Sufism seems to fit the bill. Sufism seems to serve as the meeting point between those forces in the West that regard such a soft version of Islam as more palatable or tolerable, and those Muslim apologists who would like to present Islam as a pacifistic, pro-coexistence religion. Books like Thomas Arnold's Preaching of Islam, a very famous book. Books like Thomas Arnold's Preaching of Islam, an old book but still relevant, make a strong case to the effect that Islam was spread in the world mainly by peace-loving Sufis. But they deliberately or conveniently ignored the fact that behind the spread of Islam through Sufis, behind the spread of Islam through Sufis was a politically dominant Islamic civilization which directly or indirectly aided Sufis in disseminating the message of Islam, and which in its own right was a fairly powerful incentive to non-Muslim populations under its sway to convert to Islam. I'll skip a few examples and all the way to my conclusion, a minute and a half. So what is my principal conclusion? I submit that there is a difference between being a Sufi and having a soft corner for Sufism. There is preponderant evidence to show that Iqbal would not approve of systematic Sufism, if the expression be allowed. He had no sympathy for several of the major tenets of Sufism as historically understood and practiced by the vast majority of those who call themselves Sufis. By true, genuine, Quranic or Islamic Sufism, Iqbal simply meant actions of sincere devotion, ikhlas fil amal, as he put it in more than one letter. And letters, Iqbal had a soft corner, a very soft corner for Islamic law also. That does not make him a jurist. And in spite of his severe criticism of Islamic theology, he at times praised his deficit in the reconstruction. That does not make him a Muslim theologian as such. Iqbal's passion for the Islamic spiritual, intellectual heritage of tradition is quite obvious in his works. In his study of that tradition, however, he takes a quite dispassionate approach, offering a critique of it. The word critique, understood in the original sense of the Greek word kritain, to discriminate, of which the Arabic counterpart is naqd, which is used in the same sense in several other Islamic languages also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mir. Now we have, for very inspiring and interesting approach, contribution, which is a different approach, a different angle from the first one, contribution this morning. We are very much behind now, our schedule, but we we need some time now to discuss. I cannot decide whether you actually agree or not, so I think if you have questions and comments, we need to take at least 20 minutes if we can do it by 1:30 and then have our lunch.
My name is Rana Javed, and I'm chief editor for Denmark Times. First of all, to Dr. Javed, I'm really inspired by the way you have connected splits and those, as we were saying, broken expressions into your expression, formulation of balancing reformation. I was wondering that how you can protect your understanding of, alienation balancing and with the real impact of Sufism in terms of, as Professor Mir was saying, that it appears to me that there is a really big disconnect between when you say flipping or deliberate, in terms of competing with other views on Sufism, especially for Iqbal, actually, as we now know, with a comparative view, that it was not exactly as he was looking, he was reconstructing Islamic thoughts in terms of just maybe bridging the gaps if somebody had an understanding. What is your view on this? Shall we call it a balancing instead of broken and anxiety and splits? Do you agree with that? Is there?
Well, I guess I don't see incompatibility there, because I think to be a self-conscious reconstructor, you do need some experience of alienation and breaking, so that you can reflect critically on the traditions that you're trying to appropriate. I think it's part and parcel of being of the kind of self that can be produced by colonial modernity. And I don't really understand. I don't see the incompatibility. Are you saying there is an incompatibility?
No, I'm saying the appropriate for Iqbal when he was reconstructing, not Islam rather, you had said several times, reconstructing Islam.
Yeah.
Islamic thoughts. So I was wondering that really he was not clearly a Sufi.
Yeah.
And it doesn't appear that he was criticizing it in a way. He was just presenting his understanding. So I was wondering that when you reconstruct it, you have several different thoughts, observations which come.
Yeah,
is it fair to say that he, I was just wondering that if it's...
I think reconstruction is a complex process, and all I was trying to say is there are these different strands of complexity in the act of reconstruction. And so reconstruction, I think by its very nature it's complex. So there will be balancing acts, there will be selective appropriations, there will be rejections. The entire point is to dramatize that reconstruction as a process. And I think that not as something that is necessarily achieved or reaches an end point. The interesting thing about Iqbal is how important the motif of journey and travel is in his work. It seems to me that for him, Muslim identity is always a traveling identity. It's always journey, it's always in process. So I think to fix it in the way that you're suggesting, that is he, and even as Professor Mir said, is he, I think we agree on mostly, is he or is he not a Sufi, is kind of to, and can we kind of pin him down, is kind of to narrow his contribution and his approach to reconstruction, and also to simplify the very complex context in which he's working, because as I said, the context is how colonialism and modernity come together. In a way in which that is not the context in Western Europe, and that automatically means you're already operating in multiple or even triple contexts. Not just double context, but triple context. So, you're operating within European thought, operating within your own thought, and then on top of that, there's also kind of wider Indian intellectual landscape. So, I think that's.
Professor Mir, if you would like to shed some light on, alignment of will of people and alignment will of God, he's saying in terms of that he categorically actually at many points you recited that he with the khudi and the khudai. Would you like to say something further on that? If you elaborate more on that, just to enlighten us.
I'm not sure enlightenment will result.
Let's try. We did with the lamp. So in that context.
In the two Masnabis, Sara Khudi and Muzabir Khudi, Iqbal talks about developing one's Khudi and then bringing it under a certain discipline in order to make it, just as we have a mountain stream is coming down the mountain, rushing down. It can spill water over here, there, and so on. But if you channelize it, you make it more productive. That is the purpose of Virkhudi. And the discipline that Iqbal speaks of is derived from the Quran. The steps that he mentions are taken from the Islamic scripture. And that means subjecting oneself to the will of God. See, the will of God and the will of man are not taken as two conflicting things, but choosing a slave has no will at all. So if a slave follows the will of the master, that's not a free choice. But if a free person chooses to follow God's will, discipline, code that he furnishes humanity with, after weighing the pros and cons, considering all possibilities, that is a free choice. And it does not mean the extinction of the human will at all. It simply means the two are now in sync with each other. And then you derive strength from that largest source to which you have committed yourself. Freely, that is the key. Keep in mind the choice of a slave to follow the master's will, and the choice of a free person to follow the master's will of somebody else. Ultimately, the force is God.
Samir?
Yes. Professor Javed, at different places you mentioned reconstruction of Islam, while Iqbal, I have not seen anywhere that he talks about reconstruction of Islam, but he said reconstruction of Islamic thought. That to me, the traditional Islam, to be, which is literally what we are doing daily, what we have heard, say Hadith Sharif, about Hadith Sharif, we can revise that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is the reconstruction of religious, well, it's interesting, it's the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. It's not the reconstruction of Islamic thought. And that's what, the point being, that's partly what I was saying, that in parts of his work, as you do know, he's interested not just in the place of Islam alone, but the place of religion. But I think the emphasis on thought is important because that actually is a weakness in his work. It is that Iqbal is ultimately interested in the conceptual structure of ideas. And as a result, he didn't really engage fully with the economic or political processes of colonialism. And I mean, that could be argued is a weakness in his thought, that he's really concerned with the history of ideas alone.
Thank you for two very insightful and inspiring speeches. I was just thinking, and it might not be a very well-formulated question, but I was thinking that we are talking about modernity and the context that Iqbal was living in at that time and what he was inspired by, but how can we see that in the context of living in a postmodern world? So how can we bring Iqbal, how can he still be relevant in today's world where we are talking about breaking down the big narratives and deconstructing, not so much about reconstructing, the discourses are more about deconstructing.
Yeah.
So that was, I was just reflecting on it.
No, that's... You guys should have asked. No, I think that's again important because I think deconstruction and reconstruction go hand in hand. I mean, it's not. I mean, the very term means that you are doing something again. I mean, it's not the construction of religious thought in Islam; it's reconstruction. So you are working with the rubble of devalued tradition. But I think it is an important question because it seems to me where the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam is very important is that it is an attempt to reintegrate Islam into a global narrative of modernity and to argue that the rejection of Aristotelian logic by early Muslim thinkers actually laid the foundation for some kind of empirically minded science. And so, in a sense, what I would say is, in many ways, it's even more suited now with the collapse of the USSR, as we're moving into another phase of world history. Because I don't actually see it so much as what I see with what this Hart and Negri have argued in their book Empire is that we may be living with the legacy of European colonialism, but with the collapse of the USSR, now what we are faced with is a new kind of imperialism, which is basically global capitalism. So the issue is not about deconstructing narratives, but the growth of a new global narrative. Actually, and in that sense, Iqbal's attempt to reconstruct a global narrative is I think, very prescient. And the other thing I think is important about Iqbal is, as I mentioned, think about Bange Dara, just the title of this poetry and the importance of motifs of journeys and travel in his work, and as I said, the recreation of Islam as a traveling identity. It seems to, or the Muslim identity as a traveling identity, it seems to fit much better with the mobile landscape of modernity as we are now faced with. With migrancy being an important part, an important feature of modernity. And similarly, I mean, I think we hold on to terms like the West and Islam, but I mean, it seems obvious to me that in contemporary Europe and Britain, I'm not really sure what those terms mean, because not just with the significant populations that are, say, in the UK, I don't know about Denmark, but also that, again, that there's that case in the reconstruction of religious thought. My interpretation of it is that the boundaries between Islam and the West become very porous in that work, and that is part of his argument. That he actually says that European modern culture is a kind of extension of Muslim culture. So the terms Islam and the West become very fluid and porous terms. And I think that, again, is very prescient, because it seems to me that's something we need to look at. I mean, part of the problem is trying to fix these categories, West and Islam, in ways which I think cannot be fixed with. They're very multifaceted categories.
I can just add to that. If I can just make one comment to that. And that is, in studying Iqbal or any other writer for that matter, I think we should not make a strong case to the effect that Islam was spread in the world mainly by peace-loving Sufis. But they deliberately or conveniently ignored the fact that behind the spread of Islam through Sufis, behind the spread of Islam through Sufis was a politically dominant Islamic civilization which directly or indirectly aided Sufis in disseminating the message of Islam, and which in its own right was a fairly powerful incentive to non-Muslim populations under its sway to convert to Islam. I'll skip a few examples and all the way to my conclusion, a minute and a half.
Fine.
So what is my principal conclusion? I submit that there is a difference between being a Sufi and having a soft corner for Sufism. There is preponderant evidence to show that Iqbal would not approve of systematic Sufism, if the expression be allowed. He had no sympathy for several of the major tenets of Sufism as historically understood and practiced by the vast majority of those who call themselves Sufis. By true, genuine, Quranic or Islamic Sufism, Iqbal simply meant actions of sincere devotion, ikhlas fil amal, as he put it in more than one letter. And letters, Iqbal had a soft corner, a very soft corner for Islamic law also. That does not make him a jurist. And in spite of his severe criticism of Islamic theology, he at times praised established in the reconstruction. That does not make him a Muslim theologian as such. Iqbal's passion for the Islamic spiritual, intellectual heritage or tradition is quite obvious in his books. In his study of that tradition, however, he takes a quite dispassionate approach, offering a critique of it. The word critique, understood in the original sense of the Greek word kritain, to discriminate, of which the Arabic counterpart is naqd, which is used in the same sense in several other Islamic languages also. Thank you. Make a strong case to the effect that Islam was spread in the world mainly by peace-loving Sufis, but they deliberately or conveniently ignored the fact that behind the spread of Islam through Sufis, behind the spread of Islam through Sufis was a politically dominant Islamic civilization which directly or indirectly aided Sufis in disseminating the message of Islam, and which in its own right was a fairly powerful incentive to non-Muslim populations under its sway to convert to Islam. I'll skip a few examples and all the way to my conclusion, a minute and a half.
Fine.
So what is my principal conclusion? I submit that there is a difference between being a Sufi and having a soft corner for Sufism. There is preponderant evidence to show that Iqbal would not approve of systematic Sufism, if the expression be allowed. He had no sympathy for several of the major tenets of Sufism as historically understood and practiced by the vast majority of those who call themselves Sufis. By true, genuine, Quranic or Islamic Sufism, Iqbal simply meant actions of sincere devotion, ikhlas fil amal, as he put it in more than one letter. And letters, Iqbal had a soft corner, a very soft corner for Islamic law also. That does not make him a jurist. And in spite of his severe criticism of Islamic theology, he at times praised established in the reconstruction. That does not make him a Muslim theologian as such. Iqbal's passion for the Islamic spiritual, intellectual heritage or tradition is quite obvious in his books. In his study of that tradition, however, he takes a quite dispassionate approach, offering a critique of it. The word critique, understood in the original sense of the Greek word kritain, to discriminate, of which the Arabic counterpart is naqd, which is used in the same sense in several other Islamic languages also. Thank you.